And God, we give you thanks for bringing us through the darkness of the night to the light of the morning. We thank you for helping us to rise and shine to greet this day. In this moment, take our eyes and see through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hands and work through them. Oh God, take our hearts and set them on fire. Amen. Salt and light. Salt and light seem to be the focus of the gospel that we just heard. It is an important passage, and I'll come back to it in a moment, but I want to begin with that first reading that we heard from the prophet Isaiah. You know, we often refer to the prophet Isaiah, but biblical scholars are quite sure that the full text of this book is the work of the school of Isaiah, a group of people who gathered around the historical prophet and then continued his prophecy over 200 years from the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE. This wide range of history includes the time before the fall of Jerusalem and then the subsequent exile of the people in Babylon until they returned from their captivity. There are 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah, and the portion from which today's reading is taken comes from the time period just before the return of the people to Israel. So this was prophesied during the time when they were still in exile in Babylon. Now Isaiah is talking about how you should behave when you fast, and why you should even fast in the first place. Apparently, making a big show of fasting was part of the routine for many religious leaders of the time who would weep by the waters of Babylon over their exile, clothe themselves in sackcloth and ashes, and let everybody know that they were visibly unhappy and atoning for the predicament of the people. Now Isaiah sees right through this, and he points out that these righteous fasters miss the point. And so he says, look, you serve your own interests on your fast day and oppress all your workers. You fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. In other words, the people who fast to put on a good show translate their misery to others. And that, Isaiah says, is not the fast that the Lord proclaims. And in fact, he points out that such fasting will not make your voice heard on high. God will not take notice of that type of empty fasting. Instead, fasting should be more about what you do for others than about what you refrain from for yourself. And so, what should you do? Well, the Lord says, is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke, to share bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your home, to clothe the naked. To fast, then, is to be there for others, cheerfully giving from yourself. And then Isaiah says, if you do all of that, then your light will break forth. Your healing will spring up. The parched places will be watered. Bones will be strong. The Lord will hear you when you cry. And God will then say to you, here I am. And then you will be the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. We all want God to say, here I am, to us. We all hope that God will hear us when we lift our voice to cry. And so this wisdom from Isaiah would suggest that we need to do certain things in order to get God's attention, in order to be worthy. Or as Jesus says in the gospel, if you wish to enter the kingdom of heaven, your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Well, on the one hand, that sounds like a pretty tall order. After all, the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Jesus' time, were devoted to following God's law. Every letter of the law, every stroke of every letter of the law. But the reality is, as we know from the many encounters that Jesus has with the scribes and the Pharisees, the bar is actually set pretty low. They are like the righteous fasters from Isaiah. They are focused much more on themselves rather than on responding to the needs of others. And so there is hope for us, and Jesus is not proposing an unattainable goal in this passage. But, and this is really important, we often read this gospel passage through the distorted lens of our unworthiness. We think that we could not possibly achieve what Isaiah or Jesus are asking. And so we often begin from a place recognizing what we lack rather than from a place acknowledging what we already have. This is human nature. Child psychologists suggest that for every negative message elementary-aged children hear about themselves, they need then to hear 10 positive messages to restore their sense of self-esteem to where it had been previously. For children, to put it another way, become what they are named. Call a child bad long enough and he or she will believe you and act bad. Call a child, or an adolescent, or an adult for that matter, worthless or unlovable or shameful, and eventually he or she, all of us, will live into that name we've been assigned. But in the same way, call us good, call us useful, dependable, helpful, worthwhile, and we will grow into that identity and behavior. So how we hear this gospel passage will depend on what we have been led to believe about ourselves to this point in time. Now there's a challenge, and the challenge is that the capitalistic engine of our culture is built on the premise that we do not have everything we need, that we lack something, and therefore we need to spend in order to make up for what we lack. This is what is known as the logic of scarcity, and that logic of scarcity drives the engine of culture. Which brings us back to this comment from Jesus about salt and light. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house." Now we hear this passage, and because of our cultural conditioning that I just referred to, we might interpret Jesus' words as saying, don't lose your saltiness. Don't hide your light. Do good works instead so that you can become the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And then you will be more righteous than the scribes and the Pharisees, and you will enter the kingdom of heaven. Do these things so that you can attract the attention of God, who will then say to you, I see you. I see what you've done. Here I am. We hear Jesus' words often as a command to do something in order to become salt and light. But I actually think that that might be a misreading of this passage. Jesus does not command us to do something so that we can become what we are not yet. But rather, in the passage, Jesus commends us to be and acknowledge what we already are, salt and light. Now, I realize that Jesus goes on to say that salt can lose its saltiness and a lamp can be hidden under a basket. But the fact is that salt cannot lose its saltiness. In fact, in Hebrew culture, salt was a symbol for enduring loyalty and stability. Salt in its original form, and I'm not talking about iodized table salt, which has a shelf life of 5 years, but salt in its true form never goes bad. And then there was no electricity back in Jesus' day, so who in their right mind would put an open flame under a basket? We take that into consideration, then maybe what Jesus is saying is that once you recognize that you are salt and light, those qualities can never be taken away from you. Maybe in this passage, Jesus is naming the absurdity of losing the qualities of salt and light in order to make us more aware of these true qualities in our nature. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. There's no changing that. It's that way from the beginning. Jesus commends. He does not command. And once we realize what we really are, then everything we do is done not to win the attention of some distant God, but rather done in grateful response to the very present God who loves us as we are, salt and light. But it is a sad truth of human history that those with power often seek to dehumanize others, to make them believe that they have lost their salt and light, or perhaps never really had it at all. Over the course of our nation's history, we can see this in the shameful treatment of African Americans, women, those of the LGBTQ plus community, immigrants, and anyone who seemed to threaten the power and the authority of the scribes and the Pharisees of our own day. They employed a tactic, the tactic of dehumanizing. This tactic of dehumanizing spreads fear instead of hope, hate instead of love. This tactic of dehumanizing suppresses voices into silence, rather than doing what that wonderful hymn we will sing at the end of our service suggests, lifting up voices to sing. This tactic of dehumanizing overshadows the logic of abundance with a logic of scarcity and plugs into that negative aspect of culture. It points out what we lack rather than celebrating what we have. This tactic seeks to rob us of our salt and light. It is a tactic directly opposed to the gospel. So today, as we reflect on Isaiah's prophecy and Jesus' words, we might be a little kinder to ourselves and to each other. We might recognize when those tactics are being employed. And instead we might acknowledge what Jesus commends in us. We might embrace the truth of who we are. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. As the old Hopi saying goes, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Salt and light, repairers of the breach, restorers of streets to live in. Amen.